I first sensed something was wrong when I held the wedding invitation in my hands and noticed the groom's name was missing. The creamy cardstock shimmered with gold foil and whispered elegance. But nowhere did it say who my daughter Pamela was marrying. "It's supposed to be a surprise, Mom," she had said on the phone, her voice tinged with excitement that made my stomach churn. A surprise wedding groom was romantic in a movie, not in real life, and certainly not in my daughter's life. Something about the mystery felt less like magic and more like a well-dressed lie. Before I continue narrating the story of Amanda Harrison, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Pamela had always been the practical one, saving birthday money in envelopes and working double shifts through college without ever asking me for help. Now she was talking about custom printers, a honeymoon in the Maldives, and a Nordstrom registry like she'd won the lottery. "He believes in me," she said, her voice soft and starry. "He wants to invest in my photography, and maybe even get me studio space in Manhattan." Manhattan, my small-town daughter, raised on bulk oatmeal and clearance shoes, was suddenly talking about leases in the most expensive city in the country. "I need to meet him," I told her, gripping the invitation tighter as if I could squeeze truth from its textured paper. "This is all moving so fast, Pamela. 3 months of dating, and now you're marrying him in 2 weeks?" She hesitated, and that silence told me everything. "I promise you'll meet him at the wedding," she said eventually. "Just trust me, Mom. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me." The words stung, not because I didn't want her to be happy, but because she'd forgotten all I'd done to get her here. Every scraped-together tuition check, every meal I skipped so she could eat, every nightmare I calmed with lullabies when the power was out and the rent was overdue. I had been her foundation, her safety net, her home, and now some mysterious millionaire had swept in and stolen my place. But I bit my tongue and smiled through the phone, hiding the chill that had settled deep in my chest, because I knew something she didn't know. I had once been her. I had once been 24, infatuated and blind to red flags wrapped in velvet. And I had once trusted a man who made big promises, with soft hands and a cruel smile. His name was Larry Brennan, and he left me at the altar with an empty bank account and a positive pregnancy test I hadn't told him about yet. I never saw him again until I looked through a restaurant window and saw him holding my daughter's hand. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was walking back to my car after running errands when I passed Romano's, the downtown Italian place that hadn't changed since I was a teenager. The lighting was dim and warm, couples seated in cozy booths with white linen and wine glasses that sparkled like jewelry. I almost kept walking, but something made me turn. And there she was, Pamela, radiant and glowing, dressed like a woman in a magazine, smiling across the table at a man who looked like a ghost. His hair had gone salt and pepper, and his suit looked custom-made, but his profile was unmistakable. The angle of his jaw, the way he gestured when he talked, the subtle confidence that bled into arrogance, it all flooded back like a punch to the gut. I froze, heart racing, watching him laugh at something Pamela said. He leaned in and touched her hand across the table. That's when the world tilted. I staggered backward and braced against the glass, trying not to faint right there on the sidewalk. I pulled out my phone and pretended to scroll, using the screen's reflection to confirm what I already knew. He turned his head, and for a moment, his green eyes met mine. The same eyes that had once made me believe I was the luckiest woman alive. And now they were looking at me with nothing. No recognition, no regret, just polite curiosity. I ran. I didn't remember getting to my car, only the sound of my heartbeat crashing like thunder in my ears. My hands shook so violently I couldn't start the engine right away. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from Pamela. "Having dinner with my mystery man Smile. He's taking me shopping after." I wanted to scream. That night I didn't sleep. I paced my kitchen floor until the wood groaned beneath my steps, thinking about everything and nothing. The man who abandoned me was about to marry the daughter he never knew existed. He had infiltrated her life, bought her gifts, whispered sweet promises, all without realizing he was romancing his own child. And worse, she had no idea the man she was about to marry had once destroyed the woman who raised her. I called my sister Carol the next morning and told her what I'd seen. "You're sure it's him?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "Positive," I said, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. He looked right at me and didn't even blink. It's like I never mattered to him. "Maybe he really doesn't know who Pamela is," Carol said carefully. "Maybe it's all some horrible coincidence." But I didn't believe in coincidence anymore. Not when the man who disappeared from my life was now slipping into my daughter's as her Prince Charming. I knew I needed help. Someone who could find out what Larry had been up to all these years. So I made an appointment with a private investigator named Marcus Chen, whose office sat in a plain building with no sign and frosted windows. He was soft-spoken, polite, and asked all the right questions. When I showed him the few blurry pictures Pamela had shared on social media, careful shots that hid the man's full face, he studied them in silence. Then he turned his laptop toward me. "This man has a file," Marcus said, his voice flat but his eyes sharp. "Actually, he has several. We've been tracking him under different names for over a decade." My mouth went dry. "He's a career con artist, Ms. Harrison. Everything about this engagement is a scam." I stared at the screen as Marcus flipped through photos, dates, and aliases, each more damning than the last. Larry, or Lawrence Morrison, as one file labeled him, had spent years moving from state to state, targeting women with money or access to it. The stories followed a pattern so similar it was chilling. Whirlwind romance, expensive gifts, rushed engagement, then poof, he vanished with their savings. My throat tightened as I saw photo after photo of hopeful faces that ended in devastation. It was like staring at a gallery of ghosts, each woman a version of who I used to be. "Does he know about Pamela?" I asked, heart hammering, terrified of the answer. Marcus shook his head, tapping on one of the files. "There's no evidence he ever learned about the child you were carrying when he disappeared. He doesn't even mention you in any of these records. His MO is total detachment from past lives." My stomach flipped as I realized Larry hadn't just abandoned me, he had erased me. Over the next week, Marcus and his team dug into everything: Larry's bank accounts, shell companies, even offshore holdings. What they found painted a picture of a man who operated like a corporation, not a person. Everything about him was a lie, from his name to his profession to the sleek Mercedes he drove. He didn't own assets in his own name, using a complex network of dummy corporations to stay hidden. My daughter wasn't just in love with a fraud. She was about to legally bind herself to a predator. I considered going straight to Pamela with the truth, but I already knew what would happen. She would call me paranoid, accuse me of sabotaging her happiness, and shut the door like she had when I first voiced my doubts. The moment I pushed too hard, I would lose her, and Larry would have her all to himself. I needed something stronger than a mother's warning. I needed proof that even love-blinded Pamela couldn't ignore. That's when Marcus suggested I speak to one of Larry's previous victims, who still lived in the city. Her name was Margaret Thompson, and she had agreed to meet me under one condition: that I didn't ask her to revisit anything she wasn't ready to face. I agreed without hesitation, desperate for any insight that might save my daughter. We met at a small cafe near the river, a quiet place with chipped mugs and the smell of burnt espresso. Margaret looked older than her 60 years, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred cream into her tea. She told me about Harold, her husband of 38 years who died from cancer, leaving her a generous life insurance policy. "I was lonely, broken and vulnerable," she said, voice soft but steady. "Larry found me at a grief support group, said he'd lost someone too and understood my pain." Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. "He made me feel like I had a second chance at life, and then he took everything." Margaret's story unfolded like a nightmare, written in careful pen strokes. Dinners at high-end restaurants, long walks filled with promises, and a proposal that felt like magic until the night before their wedding. That's when he vanished, along with $180,000 from her accounts. "I reported it," she whispered, "but the police said it was a civil matter, not criminal." My heart shattered for her, and for all the other women who had no idea they were stepping into a carefully planned con. When I left the cafe, I didn't feel reassured. I felt galvanized. My pain wasn't unique, and that made it worse. Larry had turned manipulation into a profession, leaving a trail of emotional corpses behind him. But this time, he had gone too far. This time, he had chosen the wrong daughter. I met Marcus the next morning, holding Margaret's contact info like it was a weapon. "We need more," I said. "More women, more stories. Enough to draw a pattern even the FBI can't ignore." He nodded, already pulling up another file. "You're not the only one looking for justice, Amanda," he said quietly. "And you're not alone anymore." By the end of the week, we had files on 4 more women, each one echoing a version of my past. A retired teacher in Portland, a single mother in Phoenix, a widow in Florida, and a bakery owner in our very city. Their heartbreaks overlapped like a cruel song on repeat. Same phrases, same gestures, same financial ruin. And now my Pamela was the next verse. I felt sick every time I looked at her engagement photos. But Pamela didn't know the truth, and I still hadn't told her who Larry was. I told myself I was protecting her, giving her time to see the cracks for herself, but the guilt gnawed at me. Every time we spoke, I had to bite my tongue until it bled. "He makes me feel seen," she said one night, her voice dreamy through the phone. "Like I matter for the first time in my life." It broke me more than she could understand. I had spent 2 decades trying to make her feel worthy and loved. And now a stranger had convinced her that none of that had mattered. I hung up and cried for the girl who thought love looked like diamonds and silence. And I cried for the woman who'd taught her that survival meant pretending everything was okay. 10 days before the wedding, I reached out to the bakery owner, a woman named Jessica who had lost everything to Larry's charm. She agreed to meet me and Marcus at his office, walking in with her chin high but her eyes haunted. "He stole more than money," she said, taking a seat across from me. "He stole the part of me that believed people meant what they said." Her hands were calloused, her nails stained with food dye, and I realized she still baked despite the debt he left her with. "He made me think I was special," she continued, folding and unfolding a napkin as if it were his lies in paper form. We talked about expanding the bakery, franchising even. I thought he was serious. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of them together, smiling in front of a display of cakes. "He made me believe we had a future," she whispered. Then he disappeared the night after I wired him the money. I thanked her and promised to stay in touch, knowing I now had 2 living, breathing women who could back me up if I chose to confront Pamela. But I also knew my daughter's heart would need more than stories. She would need evidence so raw and undeniable it would shatter the fantasy Larry had spun around her like silk. I wasn't ready to expose the father she never knew. Not yet. Not until she saw the man for what he really was. 3 days later, I spotted Pamela and Larry again, this time in a gallery uptown that I used to frequent when I was her age. I stayed across the street, watching as they moved between paintings, Larry's hand low on her back, his mouth close to her ear. The gallery owner shook Larry's hand like they were old friends, and I recognized the exact routine he had used on me decades ago. My daughter was being sold a fantasy in brushstrokes and soft lighting, and she was falling for it exactly the way I had. That evening, I called Marcus and told him I needed to speak to more victims, ones who had met Larry recently. He hesitated, saying most weren't ready to revisit the trauma, but 2 women had agreed to talk if it meant stopping him. Their names were Sarah and Rebecca, both local, both devastated in different ways. We arranged to meet in a quiet coffee shop the next day. I barely slept that night, dread curling in my gut like a storm waiting to break. Rebecca arrived first, younger than I expected, barely older than Pamela. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, but her eyes looked hollow, like someone who'd aged years in just a few months. "He told me he was a venture capitalist," she said as she stirred her coffee without drinking it. "Said he wanted to help me open a wellness studio, yoga, massage, the works." Her voice cracked. I gave him everything I had. She handed over a folder she had brought with her bank transfers, text messages, even photos of their so-called business meetings. Larry, under yet another name, posed in a luxury office that likely wasn't his, smiling like he owned the world. "He said we'd build something together," she whispered. Instead, he emptied my account and ghosted me right before our soft launch. I squeezed her hand, feeling the trembling beneath her fingers. Sarah joined us shortly after, leaning on a cane with an uneven gait and pain behind every step. She was in her mid-30s but looked older, like grief had left permanent creases in her skin. "He met me at physical therapy after my accident," she said, sitting slowly, her jaw tight. "He said he knew what it was like to rebuild a life from scratch." Her laugh was bitter. "Turns out he just knew how to tear lives down." She showed us pictures of them at a rehab center, smiling over smoothies and talking about second chances. He'd helped her believe again, helped her let her guard down after years of pain and disappointment. "When you're healing, your heart wants to believe someone sees you," she said, rubbing her knee. "He made me feel like a woman again, not just a patient with a limp." And then he took her settlement check and disappeared. We sat together for over 2 hours, comparing timelines, spotting overlaps, and building a clearer picture of the man behind all the aliases. Every story was different in surface detail, but identical at the core. Love bombing, fast commitments, emotional manipulation, financial theft. Larry had perfected his script and tailored it to each woman's vulnerabilities, like a bespoke suit. My daughter was just the latest draft of a very old con. Only this time, he'd wandered into a house of mirrors without realizing it. I knew I had to show Pamela all of it. The names, the photos, the confessions. But something still held me back. I kept remembering the way she'd looked at him over dinner, all trust and tenderness, as if he were her safe place in a world full of sharp edges. That kind of illusion doesn't shatter quietly. It explodes. And I was terrified she'd take the blast head-on and never recover. So I waited and hoped until she called one night, her voice tight, asking if she could come over. I said yes before she could finish the sentence. When she arrived, her eyes were puffy and red, and her movements were sharp, like she was holding herself together with invisible thread. "Something happened tonight," she said, dropping her purse on my kitchen table. "And I don't know if I'm crazy or if I finally saw something I wasn't supposed to see." I poured her tea and waited, not pushing, just letting the silence stretch until she filled it. "He asked me to add his name to my bank account," she said slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "Said it would make things easier for our honeymoon expenses in case there were any emergencies." Her hands shook as she picked up the mug. "And then he started listing every account I have, details I don't remember ever telling him." She looked at me then, eyes wet with confusion and betrayal. "He knew about my inheritance from Grandma Helen, about the savings account I opened when I was 16, even about the trust fund you set up for my future kids. How would he know about that unless he was keeping tabs?" I didn't answer, just listened. The truth was unraveling in her hands, like a thread she didn't know she'd been holding all along. "I told him I needed to think about it," she continued, staring into her tea like it held answers. "And he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then he said something about trust being the foundation of any marriage." She swallowed hard. It felt like a threat. That's when I knew she was ready. I reached for the folder I had kept in a locked drawer for days, thick with photos, testimonies, and timelines. "I have something to show you," I said softly, sliding it toward her. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents like she wasn't sure she was awake. "His name isn't what he says it is. None of this is what you think it is." She read in silence for a long time, tears running freely as she pieced together the man she loved into someone monstrous. Every line cracked her world a little more. And then, when she reached a photo of Larry from 26 years ago, the year I was left at the altar, she froze. "Mom," she whispered, "that's him." I nodded, unable to speak. "That's the man in my dreams," she said. "The one you said disappeared before I was born." Her voice had turned hollow, like a sound echoing from the bottom of a well. She stared at the photo, not blinking, not breathing, the full weight of recognition pressing down on her chest. I watched her fingers tighten on the edges of the paper, as though she could crumple away what it meant. "You told me he left before I was born," she said, her eyes finally lifting to mine. "You never showed me a picture. I didn't want you to grow up resenting someone who never even tried," I said, feeling like a coward all over again. I didn't know if telling you would make you stronger or just poison your childhood." Pamela shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "You told me he was a mistake. You never said he could show up again." "I never thought he would," I admitted, my voice cracking. "He vanished completely. No phone calls, no letters, no trace of who he really was." She looked back at the folder, flipping through evidence with eyes that had gone dry and sharp. "He didn't know who I was, did he?" she asked. "He seduced me without realizing I was his daughter." I paused, then nodded once. "He didn't recognize you. He didn't care enough back then to even imagine who his child would become." Pamela stood abruptly, pacing across the room, the weight of betrayal making her movements erratic. "How is that possible?" she muttered. "How can someone forget their own blood?" I didn't have an answer that would fix any of it. I just watched my daughter unravel, her dream dress now stitched from lies and bone-deep shame. "Did he ever ask about me?" she asked suddenly, turning to face me with eyes that demanded honesty. I shook my head slowly. "Not once." Pamela folded her arms across her chest, her expression hardening like cooling steel. "So I was just a pawn," she whispered. "A stranger he could use, like all the others." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Except this time the stranger was his own daughter. The silence that followed was suffocating. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. Colder, calculated, like a storm preparing to hit land. "We can't just let him get away with this." I nodded, already knowing what she meant. "I have people," I said quietly. "Victims, documents, timelines. We can take this to the authorities." Pamela's nod was sharp, decisive. "Then we do it. But not before the wedding." Her plan startled me at first. She wanted to go through with the ceremony, at least pretend to, so she could expose him in front of everyone. "I want him to see the truth fall apart in his hands," she said. "He built his life on lies, so let's pull the curtain at the climax." I tried to talk her out of it, but she was resolute. "He needs to be humiliated, the same way he humiliated all of you." She reached for her phone and texted her maid of honor to say everything was still on. "He won't suspect anything," she said. "I'll act normal, even happier than before." I didn't like it, but I understood the vengeance pulsing under her skin. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming power. The power he had stolen from every woman he had ever touched. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and secrecy. Marcus coordinated with the FBI, who had already been building a case against Larry under one of his other aliases. With the new testimonies and financial documents from Rebecca and Sarah, they had enough to make an arrest. "We'll be at the wedding," Marcus assured me. "But he has to be caught in the act, still pretending to be the man he isn't." Pamela played her part so well it frightened me. She smiled through brunches and fittings, kissed Larry on the cheek in public, and posted captions online that read like fairy tales. "He makes me feel like the luckiest girl in the world," one read, with a photo of them holding hands at a wine tasting. Larry beamed in the picture, utterly unaware that his mask was moments from cracking. Watching them, I realized just how deep his delusions went. The night before the wedding, Pamela stayed at my house instead of the hotel suite he'd booked for her. "I don't want to see him until it's time," she said, curling up under the same quilt she'd used as a child. Her face in sleep looked young again, the pain of the past few days smoothed away by exhaustion. I sat beside her bed for hours watching her breathe, torn between fury and grief. I had wanted to protect her from ever knowing this kind of betrayal. Morning arrived shrouded in gray clouds, the kind that promised a downpour but never quite delivered. I dressed slowly, slipping into the same wedding dress Larry had given me 26 years ago, the one he never saw me wear. It still fit, though now it clung to me like history refusing to let go. I pinned up my hair and looked in the mirror at a woman forged in fire and abandonment. Today would not end in heartbreak. Pamela met me downstairs, her own gown shimmering with lace, and the kind of promise that had once made her believe in magic. She didn't smile as we hugged, but her eyes were steady. "Let's end this," she said. We rode in separate cars to the venue, both of us bracing for what had to be done. I watched the countryside pass, thinking about every version of Larry that had existed in our lives. The venue was grand: marble floors, tall ceilings, gold chandeliers swinging gently from above. Guests in expensive suits and dresses filtered in, their laughter and chatter floating like perfume. Pamela's bridesmaids flitted about nervously, unaware that the ceremony would end with handcuffs instead of rice. I stood near the back, clutching my small clutch like a lifeline. When the music began and Pamela stepped into view, I knew the moment was near. Larry stood at the altar, calm and composed, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. But when his eyes landed on me, on the dress he gave me long ago, his face blanched, his spine stiffened, and he looked again, just to be sure. I saw the precise moment he realized who I was. And then, his gaze shifted to Pamela. The officiant cleared his throat and began the usual litany. Guests sat straighter, phones tucked away, anticipation thick in the air. Pamela walked slowly, her gaze locked on Larry, and the room held its breath. She reached the altar, took his hands, and leaned in. "Let's tell them the truth," she said, loud enough for the microphone to pick up every word. Larry flinched, his smile faltering as murmurs rippled through the pews. Pamela didn't let go of his hands. She gripped them tighter, like she was holding a snake that had just been cornered. "You said honesty was the foundation of a marriage," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "So let's be honest with everyone." The officiant looked frozen, glancing from Larry to the guests and back again. The crowd shifted, uneasy as Pamela stepped back and turned to face them. "This man isn't who you think he is," she announced, her bouquet slipping to the floor with a soft thud. "His name isn't Alexander Price or whoever he's pretending to be today." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "This is Lawrence Morrison, a career con artist who's stolen millions from women across the country." Gasps erupted across the room like popping champagne corks. Some guests turned toward each other in confusion. Others fumbled for their phones, no doubt Googling the name she'd just spoken. Larry tried to speak, but Pamela raised her hand, silencing him. "Don't," she said. "You've had enough chances to tell the truth." The doors at the back of the hall opened, and two men in dark suits entered quietly, scanning the room. Larry noticed them, and his shoulders tensed. Marcus stood just behind them, nodding once at me before fading into the background. Pamela took a breath and pointed at me. "That's my mother," she said. "And 26 years ago, he left her at the altar wearing that exact dress." Larry's head snapped around to look at me, and I didn't flinch. The shock on his face turned to disbelief, then to something darker. I saw it, the realization that he had seduced his own daughter without ever realizing it. The horror of it finally cracked his mask. "You knew?" he choked, eyes darting between us. "No," Pamela answered before I could. "But she did, and she tried to warn me." She stepped back from him entirely now, leaving a space between them that felt like a canyon. "But I wouldn't listen, because I believed in you." The agents moved closer, flashing their badges. "Lawrence Bradley Morrison," one of them said. "You're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud." Larry's eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit. "Don't even try it," Marcus said quietly from the aisle. "This room is surrounded." The agent read Larry his rights while guests gasped and filmed, their expensive dresses and polished shoes suddenly out of place in the drama unfolding before them. Larry didn't resist. He couldn't. His face was a mask of disbelief, shame, and something I recognized as exhaustion. Maybe he'd grown tired of running. Maybe being caught was easier than living another day in the web he'd spun. Pamela stood frozen as they cuffed him, her shoulders squared but her eyes glassy. I moved toward her, heart thudding, hands trembling despite everything we'd prepared. She didn't resist when I wrapped my arms around her. She only whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. You were right the whole time." "I wish I hadn't been," I whispered back, burying my face in her hair. "I wish this had never touched you." But it had. Larry had touched every part of her life. Her hopes, her trust, her understanding of love. He had broken something no one could see, and only time would reveal the cracks. Guests began leaving quietly, whispering to each other, their perfect day unraveling like a torn veil. Margaret, Jessica and Sarah slipped in beside us, their faces tight but proud. Pamela turned to them, recognizing them from the photos in the folder. "You're the other women," she said softly. "He did this to you too?" Jessica nodded, her voice gentle. "He did. And your mother helped us make sure he never does it again." Sarah reached out and squeezed Pamela's hand. "You're not alone in this." And for the first time all day, my daughter began to cry. We left the venue together, not in celebration but in solidarity. Margaret helped Pamela into the car while I gathered what was left of her bouquet. The flowers were still fresh, beautiful even, but they meant nothing now. Just symbols of a dream that had been built on rot. As we drove away, I didn't look back. That night, Pamela curled up on my couch in sweatpants and an old college hoodie, her makeup washed away but her eyes still rimmed in red. "I keep replaying it," she whispered, staring at nothing. "Everything he said to me, how he looked at me, touched me." Her voice broke. How could he not know? "I think he never wanted to know," I said gently, brushing hair back from her forehead. "He moved through people, not with them. You were a means to an end, like all the others." That truth hurt more than any lie. She turned her face into the pillow, her voice muffled. "I feel sick just thinking about it. I didn't have a cure for that kind of sickness. Only time and love." "It wasn't your fault," I said, sitting beside her. "He was an expert in finding what people needed and pretending to give it." My fingers found hers, and she squeezed back weakly. Over the next few days, the fallout came fast. Local news picked up the story after video clips of the arrest started circulating online. The headlines ranged from tragic to scandalous, but they all told the same story. Millionaire Groom exposed as serial conman at wedding. Pamela didn't leave the house, and I didn't ask her to. She needed space to grieve. Not a man, but the version of herself that had believed in him. We watched the news together when the FBI released an official statement. They'd been building a case against Larry for months, but our evidence had tied everything together. Over 15 aliases, multiple states, and more than 30 known victims. Pamela didn't say much, just stared at the screen with a look I couldn't name. It wasn't sadness. It was something harder, more resolved. Pamela barely touched her food for days, and I didn't push her to eat. She would sit in silence, sometimes on the porch, sometimes curled up in her old bedroom, staring out the window with a faraway look in her eyes. I knew she wasn't just mourning Larry. She was mourning herself, the version of her who had believed in magic and second chances. That kind of grief doesn't leave scars. It leaves silence. And in that silence, she began to rebuild. 2 weeks after the wedding, Marcus stopped by with updates from the FBI investigation. "They've linked him to 5 more aliases since the arrest," he said, laying a folder on the kitchen table. 2 were active as recently as last year, both involving engagement scams. I felt Pamela stiffen beside me, but she didn't interrupt. "They're estimating total financial damage upwards of $3 million, Marcus added. "Will the victims get any of that back?" she asked, her voice flat but present. Marcus sighed, flipping to a spreadsheet. "Some of it, maybe. He kept money in offshore accounts, but he laundered most through fake companies. Tracing it is like chasing smoke." Pamela nodded, as if confirming a theory she'd already suspected. "He knew exactly how to disappear." That night, she asked if I still had the old photo album from when I was pregnant. "I want to see him back then," she said. "Not the man he became, but the one you thought he was." I retrieved the dusty book from my closet, its leather cover cracked with age, and handed it to her. We sat side by side as she turned the pages, stopping at a photo of me and Larry at a picnic in '98. He was smiling, his arm around me, the sunlight turning his hair almost gold. I looked so young, my eyes wide with trust and foolish dreams. "You really loved him," Pamela whispered, her finger tracing the edge of the photograph. "I did," I said, "until the moment I realized he loved no one but himself." She closed the album gently, setting it aside like something sacred and dangerous. "He said so many things to me that I thought were spontaneous," she murmured. "Now I can hear them in the stories of those other women, word for word." Her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles whitening. "It was never about me. I was just another mark." "You're more than that," I said firmly. "You're more than what he tried to make you." Pamela looked at me, her eyes full of something raw. "Then help me prove it." She stood, straighter than I'd seen her in weeks. "I want to speak out." And she did. Pamela began attending the survivor support group I'd helped Margaret start, quietly at first, then more openly. She shared her story not as the conman's daughter, but as his almost victim, her voice shaking the first time she spoke. But each time, she grew stronger, more certain. "If I hadn't seen that folder," she said once, "I would have handed him everything, including my life." The group began to grow, fueled by media attention and the haunting power of shared trauma. More women came forward, some with fresh wounds, others with old scars they'd never dared reveal. Jessica started coordinating legal advice sessions. Sarah helped organize therapy resources. Margaret facilitated financial recovery workshops. Pamela created a digital archive, a timeline of Larry's frauds, with redacted victim names but full transparency. The site quickly became a resource for law enforcement and other victims around the country. One afternoon, while updating the site, Pamela looked over at me. "I've been thinking about changing my last name," she said. "To yours." My breath caught. "You don't have to do that," I said softly. "But I want to," she replied. "I'm not his daughter. I'm yours." The paperwork was filed a week later, and her new identification came in the mail a month after that. She held it like a trophy, her name printed clean and proud, Pamela Marie Harrison. We celebrated with takeout and laughter, the first time either of us had laughed freely in a long time. The wound hadn't healed, but it had scabbed over with purpose and pride. "I don't feel like a victim anymore," she said, clinking her soda against mine. Still, not everything could be undone. The dreams she'd spun around Larry didn't simply vanish. They lingered in unexpected places. The honeymoon plans in a drawer, the engagement ring in a velvet box beneath her bed, the scent of his cologne clinging to a coat she hadn't thrown away yet. Healing was not a straight line. Some days she woke up angry, other days she woke up hollow. But through it all, she kept building. She returned to work part-time, then full-time, easing back into her photography with hesitant steps. Her first shoot back was for a local shelter's adoption campaign, and the portraits she took, raw, kind, beautifully lit, moved people to tears. "You captured something honest," the shelter manager told her. Pamela just smiled and said, "That's all I want now." As the trial date approached, tension settled over our house like fog. Larry had pled not guilty, of course, relying on his lawyer's ability to cloud the truth with technicalities and charm. But the FBI had built a damning case, and with over 20 women ready to testify, the odds weren't in his favor. Pamela received a subpoena to appear, not just as a witness, but as a final link tying him to his own child. She asked me if I'd be there when she testified. "I wouldn't miss it," I said. "You're braver than I ever was." She nodded, clutching her copy of the court summons like a sword. It's time we both stopped letting him define our lives. We stood together in the kitchen, and for the first time in years, I saw my daughter fully grown. Not just older, but truly changed. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, all polished wood and in different light. Larry looked smaller than I remembered, his suit too crisp, his expression guarded but hollow. He didn't glance our way. Pamela walked past him with her chin high, her heels echoing like punctuation marks. I watched him flinch when he heard her name announced by the bailiff, Pamela Harrison. The trial began with procedural motions, but the air in the courtroom buzzed with tension. Every woman seated behind the prosecution's table had a story, and every story followed the same outline: charm, trust, theft, and abandonment. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The truth was devastating enough on its own. Larry sat still, occasionally leaning toward his attorney, but his eyes rarely lifted. If he felt shame, he buried it deep beneath his now useless facade. Pamela was called on the third day of testimony. She walked to the stand in a simple navy dress, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a braid that made her look younger but stronger. I sat gripping the edge of my seat as she was sworn in, my heart beating so loudly I could barely hear the first few questions. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Pamela Marie Harrison," she replied, steady and clear. They began gently, asking about her relationship with the defendant, how they met, how quickly things progressed. Her answers were measured, but I could see her hands trembling slightly where they rested on her lap. "He told me I was special," she said, "that he believed in my dreams. He promised me the kind of life I never thought I'd deserve." The room was silent, the jury visibly moved by her honesty. "When did you begin to suspect something was wrong?" the prosecutor asked. Pamela inhaled slowly, then answered. "When he started listing my financial details like he'd memorized a report. He knew things I'd never told him twice, but he forgot everything that made me me." A few jurors exchanged glances, the gravity of her words settling like dust. "And did you find out who he really was?" the prosecutor continued. "Yes," she said. "With the help of my mother and others, he's victimized." Then she added quietly, "He's also my biological father." Gasps broke from the courtroom gallery, and the judge banged his gavel twice. Larry looked up sharply, the first real emotion flashing across his face since the trial began. It wasn't anger or guilt, it was fear, not for what he'd done, but for what had just been laid bare before strangers, under oath, in legal record. For once, he couldn't manipulate the narrative. The prosecutor moved on, letting that truth hang heavy in the room. Pamela continued her testimony, describing how her mother had uncovered Larry's identity, how she'd confronted him, and how the arrest unfolded. She answered every question with clarity, her voice never breaking, even when her words trembled. I felt pride and sorrow mingling in my chest. She was doing what I couldn't do all those years ago. She was standing up not just for herself, but for all of us. When the defense attorney stood to cross-examine her, the room tensed again. "Miss Harrison," he began, "you described a romantic relationship with the defendant that lasted several months, correct?" Pamela nodded. "Yes. Would you agree that during that time you never suspected he might be your father?" Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "No, I didn't suspect. Because I was never told who my father was." The lawyer tried to pivot, casting doubt on how she could have misjudged someone so badly. "And yet you fell in love with him?" he asked. "Yes," she answered firmly, "because he lied about everything, including who he was." Her voice rose just slightly, steel creeping into her tone. "Are you saying that makes this my fault?" The lawyer backed off, realizing the trap he'd walked into. "No further questions," he muttered, sitting down. Pamela stepped down from the witness stand without looking at Larry, but I saw her fingers clench as she passed him. She returned to her seat beside me, exhaling like she'd just surfaced from deep underwater. I took her hand and squeezed it gently. Other women testified over the next few days: Margaret, Jessica, Sarah, and several new faces I hadn't met. Their stories were different, only in detail, each one another nail in the coffin of Larry's defense. The jury watched them with a mix of pity and anger, their patience for his manipulation visibly wearing thin. It was hard to argue coincidence when 20 voices told the same tale. Harder still when documents, transfers, and text records backed up every word. Larry never took the stand, and his silence became its own kind of testimony. His lawyer made one last-ditch plea about insufficient evidence and the dangers of emotional bias. But the jury saw through it, and they didn't take long to deliberate. I was there when the verdict came in. "Guilty," the foreperson said, and Pamela's hand flew to her mouth. She didn't cry, not right away. She just sat there, frozen, as though she hadn't dared believe this day would actually come. Larry stared at the floor, his jaw tight, but his face otherwise unreadable. I wondered if he was finally realizing the cost of a lifetime of lies, or if he simply mourned the loss of control more than anything else. The judge sentenced him a month later, 15 years in federal prison without parole. It wasn't enough for what he'd done, but it was something. As he was led away in handcuffs, Pamela and I stood together in the back of the courtroom. He glanced at us once, and this time, I didn't look away. He blinked and turned his head, unable to hold our gaze. After the sentencing, a strange peace settled over our lives. Not quiet, exactly, but calm. Pamela returned to her photography full-time, using her skills to document stories of women rebuilding after loss. The support group continued to grow, expanding into other cities. Margaret called often, and Jessica even reopened her bakery in a new neighborhood. Sarah sent updates from her physical therapy clinic where she now volunteered part-time, helping other survivors regain strength. One day, Pamela showed me a draft of a book she'd started writing. It wasn't about Larry exactly. It was about recovery, resilience, and reclaiming your life after betrayal. "I don't want him to be the center of the story," she said. "I want the healing to be." I nodded, because I understood exactly what she meant. Spring arrived quietly, with soft rain and warmer mornings, and for the first time in years, my house felt like a place for beginnings instead of endings. Pamela moved back in for a while, not out of necessity, but because we both needed the comfort. We developed a new rhythm: coffee on the porch in the mornings, quiet dinners, late-night conversations that healed old wounds. The wedding dress still hung in the garment bag in my closet, and sometimes I'd find her looking at it. She never touched it, just stared like it was a relic from a life she barely remembered living. One morning she asked, "Do you think I'll ever be able to trust someone again?" Her voice wasn't fearful, just uncertain, like she was testing the ground beneath her feet. I didn't answer right away, because I didn't want to lie. "Yes," I said finally, "but it will be a different kind of trust. The kind you build slowly, not the kind that sweeps you off your feet." Pamela nodded, eyes thoughtful, and I saw her tuck the truth into herself like a seed. Her healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks and days she didn't want to leave her room. But every week she seemed to reclaim a little more of herself. She started going for walks with her camera again, finding beauty in everyday corners. A cracked sidewalk, a blooming bush behind a gas station, a child's drawing taped to a mailbox. She called them proof of good things still existing. Her photography shifted too, less posed, more raw, more human. She took portraits of survivors from the group, capturing them not as victims, but as women who had remade themselves. One afternoon, she showed me a photo of Margaret smiling beside her tiny garden. She said no one had taken her picture since her wedding. That never happened, Pamela whispered. She cried when I gave her a print. That night, I cried too, but it was the good kind. We started hosting group meetings in my living room when the community center wasn't available. There was something sacred about those evenings, stories unfolding between sips of tea and nervous laughter. Every woman who stepped through our door had survived something unspeakable, but none of them wore it like a badge. They wore it like armor, forged from heartbreak, tailored in truth. Pamela listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her words landed like stones in water. Not everyone knew who Larry was to her, not at first. But when she eventually told them, the room didn't gasp or pity her. They nodded, reached out, held her hand. Because in that moment, she wasn't the daughter of a monster. She was a woman who had almost been destroyed and chose instead to rise. And in choosing to rise, she had pulled the rest of us with her. The book began to take real shape over the next few months, and Pamela let me read it chapter by chapter. Her writing was honest, graceful, and unflinching. It didn't flinch away from the pain, but it never gave it more power than it deserved. She wrote about love and illusion, about shame and silence, about how hope could become a weapon in the wrong hands. Each page felt like a step she was taking towards something new, not closure. There was no such thing, but clarity. One evening, as we folded laundry in the living room, she asked, "Do you ever wish you'd told me the truth about him sooner?" I folded a towel slowly, considering my answer. "Sometimes," I said, "but I also know you wouldn't have believed it. You had to see the truth in your own way." She nodded, not offended, just reflective. I think that's the hardest part, realizing how much I didn't know about myself. Her voice softened. I thought I was smart, grounded, too practical to fall for something like that. I touched her arm gently. "Being vulnerable isn't a flaw, sweetheart. It's what made you human. It's what made you brave enough to walk away." Pamela submitted the manuscript to a small publisher who specialized in memoirs, and within weeks, she received an offer. "They said it's one of the most compelling things they've ever read," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "They want to call it Shattered Mirror." The title felt right. Reflective, painful, but honest. I want people to see the cracks before they climb in too deep, she added. As the publication date approached, requests for interviews began trickling in. Some were from small podcasts, others from national outlets that had followed the courtroom drama months earlier. Pamela didn't agree to all of them, but she chose a few that felt respectful. Her message was always the same. You are not stupid for trusting someone, but you are powerful when you choose to trust yourself again. I watched as her story became something bigger than both of us. In the fall, the local museum reached out with an unusual request. They were curating an exhibit on resilience and asked if Pamela would contribute a piece. She offered one of her portraits, a close-up of Sarah's hands gripping her cane, the gold band of her wedding ring worn down but still shining. Hands that held, Pamela said in the description. But then, the curator turned to me and asked if I would contribute something too. At first, I said no. What could I offer besides memories? But Pamela looked at me gently and said, "The dress, Mom. You should offer the dress." The words hit me hard, not because I hadn't thought of it, but because I hadn't let myself believe it could mean anything more. It had once symbolized heartbreak and betrayal, but now it was the outfit I wore to a reckoning. I pulled it from the closet that night and ran my fingers along the seams. The ivory silk still shimmered, though it bore small signs of time. Tiny frays, faint discoloration beneath the neckline. I held it up to my body and looked in the mirror. Not to relive the past, but to honor how far I'd come since it was first zipped around my waist. It was no longer a relic. It was a story. We boxed it carefully and wrote the placard together. Pamela chose the wording, worn by the mother of a bride who stopped the ceremony to protect her daughter from marrying a lie. The dress was originally meant for a wedding that never happened. It became the armor for one that never should have. I read it 3 times and cried every time. We delivered it to the museum that weekend. The museum's opening night was quiet but powerful, each artifact carefully arranged to reflect survival without sensationalism. Guests moved through the gallery with reverent silence, pausing longest at the wedding dress. I stood nearby, watching strangers study the placard, their eyes widening slightly as they read the story behind the silk. No one asked questions, but several people turned to Pamela and nodded, a silent thank you from one survivor to another. She wore a simple black dress that night, her expression composed, but her fingers occasionally tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Later, she confessed that seeing the dress under glass had made something inside her click. "It doesn't belong to me anymore," she said. "It belongs to the story." I understood what she meant, how something that once represented a personal wound could become collective healing. "It's strange," she added, "how something so painful can be part of something so good." The publisher scheduled her first book signing for the following month at a small independent bookstore downtown. We arrived early, expecting a modest crowd, but the line wrapped around the building before noon. Pamela looked overwhelmed, but she smiled as she signed each copy with steady hands. Some readers cried as they approached her, whispering their own stories or simply saying, "Thank you." I stood near the back, proud and humbled, remembering the day she first asked if she'd ever trust again. When the last copy was signed and the doors finally closed, she slumped into the nearest chair and exhaled. "I didn't think I could do that," she whispered. "You did," I replied. "And you did it with grace." She smiled tiredly, but it reached her eyes this time. Word about Shattered Mirror spread faster than any of us anticipated. Within 6 weeks, it hit the bestseller list for nonfiction, fueled by podcast interviews, survivor networks, and organic social media sharing. What struck readers most wasn't the scandal. It was Pamela's refusal to let the worst day of her life be the last word. She didn't write as a victim. She wrote as someone who'd come back from the brink with both fire and softness. "It's not about what he did," she'd said in one interview. "It's about what I did after." Larry's name came up occasionally in media coverage, but never with glory, only as a shadow behind the woman who had outgrown his lies. The prison hadn't made any public statements, and neither had he. "I doubt he'll read it," Pamela once said, thumbing through a copy of her own book. "But maybe that's better. He doesn't get to be part of this chapter." I nodded, hoping she'd always feel that way. Our lives found a new kind of normal, one that made room for grief but didn't let it dominate. She moved into a small apartment across town, still close enough to stop by for tea or dinner when she felt like it. I helped her hang some of her photographs, each one a reminder of what could rise from ruin. Margaret, Jessica, and Sarah all visited frequently, our bonds now deeper than shared trauma. They had become chosen family. We were women who had been undone and rebuilt, brick by painful brick. On the one-year anniversary of the wedding that wasn't, Pamela surprised me with a gift. It was a framed photograph she'd taken of me on the day of the trial, standing outside the courthouse in the old dress. My face was calm, eyes forward, wind gently lifting a strand of my hair. She called it legacy. "Because you gave me the strength to see the truth," she said, even when I didn't want to. I hung it in the hallway, where sunlight hit it just right in the mornings. Every time I passed, I remembered what it had taken to get there. Not just strength, but patience, truth, and the willingness to risk being hated for the sake of love. Pamela had hated me for a moment, yes, but only because I had refused to let her walk blind into destruction. That was the kind of love no one teaches you about. We continued speaking at small events, often side by side. Community centers, college classrooms, book clubs that had chosen Shattered Mirror as their monthly read. Pamela always told her story her way, with clarity and kindness, while I filled in the pieces from my own perspective. We didn't always share every detail. Some things were still ours, but we shared enough to light lanterns for women still wandering in the dark. By then, the museum had expanded its exhibit to include other stories of women who'd turned loss into leadership. Pamela's photo of Sarah's hands became a central image for the campaign, and her quote, "You're powerful when you trust yourself again," was printed on a plaque at the entrance. The dress remained in its case, now next to a looping video installation that played snippets from group testimonies. I watched visitors pause in front of it, often with tears in their eyes. None of them knew the whole story, but they felt it. One day, as we left the museum after a tour with new volunteers, Pamela stopped on the sidewalk. "Do you think he ever really loved anyone?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. "I think he loved being loved," I said eventually. "But I don't think he ever knew what love actually was." She looked thoughtful, then nodded. "That's what I thought too. And that's why he lost everything." I slipped my arm around her shoulder as we walked. He lost us before he even knew we were his to lose. That truth settled between us, heavy but freeing. A few weeks later, we received a letter from the prison addressed to Pamela, handwritten and stamped with an official seal. She opened it at the kitchen table, reading it once, twice, then passing it to me without a word. It was short, barely a page, and filled with hollow apologies that rang more like manipulations than remorse. "He still thinks he can spin the narrative," she said flatly, "but I'm not part of his story anymore." She folded the letter once and dropped it into the shredder without hesitation. We didn't speak of it again. Some things don't deserve closure. They deserve distance. And Larry's voice didn't belong in the house we'd rebuilt from the ground up. Especially not now, when the light through the windows felt like peace. The summer after the book release, Pamela was invited to speak at a National Women's Advocacy Summit in Chicago. The event brought together survivors, activists, and lawmakers, all working to reshape how society viewed emotional and financial abuse. Pamela's panel was called "Surviving What No One Sees," and she sat beside two women who had lost nearly everything to quiet, invisible predators. I watched from the crowd as she spoke, her voice steady, her story now polished but never rehearsed. She was no longer telling it from a place of pain. She was telling it from a place of purpose. When the panel ended, dozens of attendees lined up to meet her, some with tears in their eyes, others simply needing to say thank you. She greeted each one with grace, never rushing, never looking past their eyes. "You helped me feel less alone," one woman whispered, clutching her hand. Pamela squeezed back and said, "You were never alone. You just didn't know how many of us were out there." We spent the next day exploring the city like tourists, visiting the art museum, and eating deep-dish pizza at a place that came highly recommended. It was the first time in a long time that we'd traveled together without any underlying tension. No secrets, no avoidance, no walking on eggshells, just a mother and daughter, laughing at pigeons and bad directions, making memories that weren't stained by the past. As we walked back to our hotel that evening, Pamela turned to me on the sidewalk. "I've been thinking about adopting someday," she said. "Not right now, but when I'm ready." I looked at her, surprised but moved. "You'd be a wonderful mother," I said without hesitation. "You know what it means to protect someone." She smiled and nodded, then glanced up at the city skyline. "I don't want to be defined by what happened, but I don't want to forget it either." I understood exactly what she meant. Our past had shaped us, yes, but it didn't own us anymore. It had become one of many chapters, not the title of the book. Back home, things settled into a gentle rhythm again. Pamela continued her photography. Her work now featured in several regional galleries. She rarely mentioned Larry unless it came up through the advocacy work, and even then it was clinical. Fact, not feeling. I knew there were still scars, but she didn't pick at them anymore. The museum exhibit eventually closed, but the wedding dress remained a requested loan item for traveling showcases. It moved from city to city, part of a national display called Artifacts of Survival. Each time it was shown, someone would email Pamela or me to share how the story had touched them. Some were daughters, some were mothers, some were women who had walked away from their own Larry just in time. One such message came from a woman in her 60s who had left a controlling marriage after 35 years. "Your story reminded me that fear doesn't have to last forever," she wrote. "I thought I was too old to start over. But then I saw your dress." Pamela cried when she read it. Not from sadness, but from something like relief. She began working with a nonprofit that specialized in financial education for women rebuilding after abuse. "So many of them never had a chance to learn this stuff," she told me one night. "It's not just about budgeting. It's about recognizing red flags disguised as generosity." She designed workshops with titles like What Love Shouldn't Cost and Trust But Verify. The classes filled up faster than the nonprofit could accommodate. By the second anniversary of the failed wedding, Pamela had received an invitation to consult with state legislators on new protections for financial abuse victims. "It's weird," she said, holding the letter. "I never imagined I'd be doing this 2 years ago." I thought back to that morning in the silk dress, to the moment Larry's face turned white at the altar. "You never imagined it," I said. "But you earned it." That spring, she returned to Manhattan. Not to live there, but to photograph a survivor conference hosted by one of the advocacy coalitions. It was her first time back since the days she had imagined a future there with Larry. As she boarded the train, I saw a mix of emotions on her face. Nerves, strength, and something like peace. "This time I'm going on my own terms," she said, adjusting the camera strap on her shoulder. "No illusions, just truth." I stayed behind, tending my garden and preparing for the quiet that came when she was away. I missed her, but in a way that felt healthy, not anxious, not afraid. I had raised a daughter who could leave and return with love in her heart and strength in her step. I had done something right. And for once, I let myself feel that fully. On the final night of the conference, Pamela sent me a photo of herself, standing in front of a wall of survivor portraits she had taken. "We did this," the text said. Just those 3 words. But they carried everything: the sorrow, the fury, the triumph. Weeks later, the court sent a formal update, confirming that Larry's final appeal had been denied. He would serve his full sentence without early release. "I thought I'd feel more," Pamela said, reading the letter over breakfast. "But I just feel done." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. Not long after that, we held a small dinner at the house with Margaret, Jessica, and Sarah to celebrate the launch of a new grant program in Pamela's name. The Mirror Fund would support education, relocation, and therapy costs for women leaving high-risk financial abuse situations. We toasted with sparkling cider and passed around stories, laughter woven through hard memories. "He broke us," Jessica said, raising her glass, "but we made something stronger from the pieces." and we all clinked glasses with teary eyes. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fairy lights blinked on in the backyard, Pamela slipped her arm through mine. "You saved me, you know," she said softly. "You saved me when I couldn't see it happening." I looked at her, full of awe and ache. "No," I said. "You saved yourself. I just stood where you could find me." We sat on the porch until the stars came out, quiet in a way that only comes after the storm has passed. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and someone's wind chimes clinked in the breeze. It wasn't a dramatic ending, not the kind you read in books or watch in movies, but it was our ending, earned, whole, and honest. And for the first time in a long, long time, it was enough. Thank you for listening to Amanda's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.